There's something inherently humbling about the wilderness. No cell service, no streetlights, no backup when things go wrong. Just you, nature, and whatever hides in its shadows. I thought I understood this balance. I'd spent years hiking, camping, and immersing myself in remote areas, trusting my instincts and skills. But nothing could have prepared me for the place locals call the Shadows Vale. It started with a dare. A friend of mine, Ben, was an outdoor photographer with a penchant for seeking out the most remote and eerie locations. He swore by the beauty of Shadows Vale, a stretch of forest deep in the Appalachian range. He'd found references to it in old journals, a forgotten place where the wilderness thrived untouched by modern civilization. I couldn't even get close, Ben said one night over beers. It was like the forest didn't want me there. But you, he grinned, you're crazy enough to try. His stories were filled with vague warnings, unmarked trails, unnatural sounds, and an oppressive atmosphere that drove most people to turn back. To me, it sounded like a challenge. A week later, I packed my gear, loaded my Jeep, and set off. The drive was long, winding through increasingly narrow roads until the asphalt gave way to gravel and finally dirt. By mid-afternoon, I reached the trailhead, or what I thought was the trailhead. There were no signs, just a break in the trees barely wide enough to walk through. The forest greeted me with silence, not the peaceful kind, but a heavy, stifling quiet that pressed down on my ears. No bird song, no rustle of small animals, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I ventured in. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees grew taller, their trunks impossibly thick, with bark so dark it seemed to absorb the light. Moss draped from the branches like shrouds, and the air smelled damp and metallic, like wet stone and iron. I'd been hiking for hours when I noticed the first anomaly, a series of twisted roots forming an almost perfect spiral on the forest floor. At first, I thought it was natural, but as I continued, I saw more. Spirals carved into tree trunks, etched into rocks, even formed from scattered leaves. It didn't feel random. By the time I decided to make camp, the sun was setting, though the dense canopy had obscured most of the light for hours. I set up my tent in a small clearing and built a fire. The warmth and flickering glow provided some comfort, but the oppressive silence remained. As I ate my dinner, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling just beyond the firelight. Probably a deer, I muttered, though I gripped my flashlight tighter. The sound came again, louder this time. I shone the beam into the darkness, sweeping it across the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to press on. Maybe if I reached the heart of the forest, I'd find something, a landmark, an explanation, or at least a reason for the unease crawling under my skin. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a tangled web overhead. The air grew colder, and the ground was uneven, riddled with roots that seemed to claw at my boots. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks, a cabin. It was old, its wooden walls weathered and warped, half swallowed by the forest. Moss covered the roof, and one of the windows was cracked, the glass jagged like broken teeth. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity won. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a single room filled with decaying furniture and the smell of mildew. A table stood in the center, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. And then I saw the journal. It lay open on the table, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was erratic, scrawled in dark ink that bled into the paper. The veil is alive. It watches. It waits. Don't look into the shadows. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. It comes at dusk. I slammed the journal shut and bolted out of the cabin, my heart racing. The forest felt different now, darker and more menacing. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was broken by faint whispers, too quiet to understand. I checked my compass, but the needle spun uselessly. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't retrace my steps. The forest had changed. The path I'd followed now a tangle of roots and brambles. As the sun dipped lower, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. And then I saw them. Shadows moving between the trees. At first I thought they were animals, but their shapes were wrong. Elongated limbs, spindly figures that moved with unnatural grace. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I ran. The forest seemed to twist around me, the trees shifting as if alive. Branches clawed at my clothes, roots tripped me, and the shadows followed, their movements impossibly fast. When I burst into a clearing, I thought I was safe, until I realized it was the same clearing where I'd camped the night before. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, but something else was there, a figure, crouched low, its back to me. It turned slowly, its face obscured by shadow, but its eyes, they were hollow, endless pits that seemed to pull me in. It spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that echoed in my mind. You should not have come. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later, lying on the dirt road where I'd parked my Jeep. My gear was gone, my clothes torn, and my body covered in scratches and bruises. I don't know how I got out, but I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. The forest took something from me, something I can't name but feel in the hollow ache of my chest. And sometimes, late at night, I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, waiting for me to return. They say water has memory. It carries whispers of the past, secrets buried in its depths. I never believed that, not until the summer I spent as the caretaker of Clearwater Lake. Clearwater wasn't the kind of lake you'd see on a postcard. It was remote, surrounded by dense forest, and its surface was so dark it looked like polished obsidian. There were no tourists, no cabins lining its shore, just an old ranger station that hadn't seen use in years. I took the job because I needed the solitude. After my divorce, the idea of spending a summer alone in the wilderness sounded like exactly what I needed. My responsibilities were simple. Keep the trails clear, check the water levels, and report anything unusual. Unusual. I thought that would mean a bear sighting or a storm knocking down a tree. I didn't realize Clearwater had a history, one the locals didn't like to talk about. The first few weeks were uneventful. The days blurred together, a routine of hiking, chopping wood, and fishing off the old dock. Nights were quiet, the only sound the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the trees. But the quiet didn't last. It started with the footprints. I was walking the shoreline one morning, checking for erosion, when I saw them, a single set of bare footprints leading from the water's edge into the forest. They were small, too small for an adult, and the toes were splayed wide like they'd been in the water for a long time. I followed them for a while, but they vanished into the underbrush. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought of those footprints and the lake's black water lapping at the shore. The next day, I found more. This time, they were on the dock. Wet prints leading from the end of the planks all the way to the ranger station. I'd just gotten back from hiking one of the trails, and I knew they hadn't been there earlier. I checked the station, my heart pounding, but it was empty. That night, the dreams began. I was standing at the edge of the lake, the water perfectly still. A voice called my name, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. I couldn't see who it belonged to, but I felt compelled to step into the water. When I woke, my feet were wet, and my boots were sitting by the dock. I told myself it was sleepwalking, that the isolation was messing with my head. But things kept getting stranger. I started hearing noises at night, soft splashes, like someone walking through the shallows, and faint laughter that seemed to come from the middle of the lake. One morning, I found my fishing rod tangled in the branches of a tree 50 feet from the water. Another time, I woke to find my lantern smashed, shards of glass scattered across the floor. And then there was the figure. It was just after sunset, and I was sitting on the porch of the station, staring out at the lake. The fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, blurring the line between water and sky. That's when I saw it. A silhouette standing on the dock. It was small, childlike, and unmoving. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at me, or at least I thought it was staring. Its features were obscured, but I felt its gaze, heavy and cold. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the dock. The beam cut through the fog, but the figure was gone. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear, planning to head into town and quit the job. But as I loaded my truck, I noticed something on the windshield. A handprint, small and wet, pressed against the glass. The road leading out of the station was rough, a narrow dirt trail winding through the forest. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The figure was sitting in the bed of my truck, hunched over, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I slammed on the brakes and spun around, but the truck bed was empty. Panic surged through me, and I drove faster, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. When I finally reached town, I went straight to the diner, the only place open that late. I must have looked like hell, because the waitress poured me coffee without even asking. "You been out at Clearwater?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She sighed, glancing around like she didn't want anyone to overhear. "They don't tell people, but there was an accident out there years ago. A camp for kids. Storm rolled in, and a few of them didn't make it back to shore." She hesitated, then added, "They never found all the bodies." I left town the next morning, but Clearwater didn't leave me. The dreams continued, standing at the water's edge, the voice calling my name. Sometimes I wake up gasping, the taste of lake water in my mouth. And no matter where I go, I see the handprints, on my car, on my windows, even on the mirror in my bathroom. The voice is louder now, no longer confined to dreams. It says one thing over and over, a soft, chilling whisper: "Come back."